A father mourning the drowning of his son, a baby sucking on the still warm body of his mother who died of hunger. Throughout history, people have lived intertwined with scarcity and death. Intermittent climate disasters, periodic outbreaks, and harsh daily living conditions forced people to subsist on the land and strive to raise children who would carry on their efforts. The majority lived at or near a subsistence level. Some pondered the meaning and moral qualities of their existence in the face of the possibility of unexpected and sudden death. Basic rhythms of life and death shaped the framework of human existence, shaped their understanding of the natural world, and positioned them in the universe. Most people in the past, sooner or later, became prey to ruthless empires that would consign them to the dump of history. As much as wars, disasters, diseases, famines, unidentifiable incursions, and migrations were the dynamics of life and death. History often and sometimes collectively swallows people. It is the dance of death, whether one is a king, a prophet, or an ordinary person. Regardless of the form human life takes, it always consists of the same elements, with one person's fate resembling another's. History has never been easy for ordinary people. They were compelled to work and pay taxes during times of peace, sent to the front lines as the ruler declared war to be sacred. Often they were labeled as fugitives and traitors, and their short lives were filled with migrations, hunger, disease, and various fears. In ancient times, within an orderly system, dynasties would change, with newcomers claiming to establish a legitimate regime. The state bureaucracy, composed of individuals driven by personal interests, was nothing more than a mafia-like gang. The populace was divided into social strata such as merchants, artisans, the bourgeoisie, peasants, and slaves. The subject of history is the communities organized as societies, whose lives revolve around the necessity to produce, distribute, and consume in order to sustain themselves. People make their own history, but they do so under given conditions inherited from the past and directly confronted with the circumstances they encounter. The tradition of all dead generations continues to weigh like a nightmare on the minds of the living. The most significant events in the past were accompanied by chaos and moments of madness, alongside the ugly aspects of those in power, conflicts, massacres, and the dance of death. Emperors and kings often lacked the ability to govern their people and even posed a danger to them. The bouts of madness of King Charles IV of France weakened his kingdom. Prince Sado of Korea instilled such fear that, after being executed, his body was kept locked in a chest for 8 days. On the other hand, continuous earthquakes, epidemics, and famines followed one another. The plague in Europe wiped out 1/3 of the population. The 1755 earthquake in Lisbon claimed the lives of 55,000 people. The fire in Tokyo in 1657 took the lives of nearly 100,000 people. During the potato famine in Ireland in the 19th century, half of the population perished. Throughout hundreds of millions of years, the codes of life have been passed down to present generations. Since the dawn of humanity, 106 billion people have lived and died. As Mevlana once said, "You are not living in this world, you are passing through it." The essence lies not in life but in death. Life is a parenthesis within the dance of death. However, science and technology are bringing us closer to immortality. Throughout history, everyday life required being prepared for death and disasters. Men and women, constantly under the threat of danger, not only struggled to raise children and make ends meet but also sought to understand and improve their circumstances. Various methods were attempted to cope with illness, disability, and death. Doctors relied on medical education based on ancient texts, while faith healers, amulets, charms, prayers, and magic were among the traditional practices employed. Religion attributed the causes of death and disasters to our sins, spirits, witches, demons, and storm makers. The remedies included fasting, prayer, repentance, magic, and charms. After each disaster, the story of the impending doomsday was repeated. Wars, disasters, and deaths are actually catalysts of life. Death tears apart family relationships but also rebuilds them. In the modern world, we are in need of a new social engineering. In this video, we will provide examples from various civilizations throughout history, illustrating the struggles for power and survival, and ultimately, we will delve into the dance of death and human life. Mesopotamia is the birthplace and cradle of ancient civilizations such as Sumer, Babylon, Assyria, Akkad, and Elam. For the Sumerians, cities were the first and best refuge against floods and marauders. The desolate and barren lands beyond the cities belonged to shepherds and nomadic wanderers. The city dwellers looked down upon the unwashed peasant shepherds, while the shepherds mocked the weak and corrupted city dwellers. These cities and kings ruled over the land of farmers and wandering nomads until the first 8 kings of Sumer brought disaster upon them. People already spent their time searching for water and praying due to the fear of floods. When the Great Flood came, Utnapishtim and his family boarded a boat with a few animals and escaped. This story later gave rise to many versions, particularly in Babylon, and was revised and plagiarized into the story of Noah, along with selected Sumerian, Egyptian, and Indian myths of the divine religions. Before being written down, these myths were metaphysical tales passed down orally for centuries. This was actually a destructive regional flood that caused people to abandon their homes. According to Genesis, after the flood, God allowed humans to eat meat. As kinship-based kingdoms emerged in Sumer, Egypt, and the Indian subcontinent, China had philosopher kings who came to power through a selection based on wisdom. It was wisdom, not birth, that granted someone the right to rule. Plato later advocated for philosopher kings to govern the state. Counting sheep and beans led to the birth of accounting through coding, followed by the advent of writing. Thus, we began to learn the first stories and heroes of history. Along with greedy and quarrelsome kings, wars began around 4000 BCE. King Gilgamesh had a sword factory, and Uruk was armed in the south. The Sumerian city-state administration had 2 parliaments, one composed of elders and the other of young men. However, there was no national identity, each city-state was a small kingdom in its own right. Ancient Egypt is an ancient civilization that spread around half of the Nile River in northeast Africa. Egypt showed hints of a centralized state structure. It had a royal palace system, tax collection, and an economy that could afford to feed non-producing citizens. This economy gave rise to full-time priests who sacrificed for the king, palace nobles, and metal workers who produced jewelry for women, as well as scribes who kept the growing bureaucracy in check. Egypt's pharaohs were preoccupied with immortality research, aside from building dams, suppressing rebellions, and uncovering traitors within the palace. It was not considered ridiculous for someone to claim they had spoken with a god back then, just as it is now. Since the king was considered divine, he needed to marry another divine being, not a mortal. This left no option but to marry their own offspring. Besides resulting in blissful incestuous relationships, royal marriages produced numerous diseases and mental disabilities. When the king or pharaoh, who was considered a god while alive, died, they were accepted as the son of the new god, ensuring succession. However, in the reign of subsequent pharaohs, the claim of divinity was set aside. A king with no worries or enemies would build a new palace, go hunting, and have a temple tomb constructed for himself. The third Amenhotep had killed 102 lions. Another source states that he killed 56 wild bulls during a wild cattle hunt. Most likely, the bulls were corralled in an area before the hunt began. He built a temple for himself in Memphis and other temples along the Nile. Additionally, he married princes from different regions without discrimination. Women were desired not only for political reasons but also for pleasure. He sent a message to the governor of Gaza, a total of 40 women, each for 40 silver. Send beautiful women, but make sure none of them has a high-pitched voice. He collected his sisters and daughters, from the weakened kingdoms of the Hittites, Mitanni, and Tushratta, in Anatolia for his harem. The Hittite king had offered his own daughter because his people were starving and the granaries were empty. Amenhotep employed the same tactic with the Babylonian king, but he refused to give his own daughter in return. Amenhotep could negotiate, and manipulate to form alliances, but he never forgot that his allies were inferior in his eyes. One of the interesting city systems established was the Harappa cities along the Indus River in India, dating back to around 2300 BCE. Seals were discovered with markings used for trade goods and short scripts that no one has deciphered yet. People valued cleanliness. There were intricate sewage and drainage systems on the streets, each house had a bathroom, and there was a public bathhouse the size of a swimming pool in the city. The entire city was surrounded by 2 rows of mud walls that were well defended. In the center of the city was an inner fortress. Neither the Sumerians nor the Elamites sent an army here, nor were there wild nomadic tribes in the vicinity. The walls were high and thick, with watchtowers and gates. They did not want anyone to enter. However, without any signs of attack or war, the inhabitants of Harappa suddenly abandoned their city. There was no evidence of power struggles, warfare, or siege in an abandoned city with no resistance. However, what frightened the people is still unknown. Not everyone managed to escape. Excavations revealed the skeletal remains of a family trapped and killed in their home but left unburied. It could have been an earthquake, a flood, or a fire. Like the Shang dynasty in China, the rulers of India also remained hidden just beneath the surface of history, obscured from view. Chinese and Indian rulers occasionally emerge as glimpses amidst the commotion, but their overall contours remain indistinct. They governed their countries from behind frosted glass, providing subtle clues. What held the Indians together was not political organization or strict asceticism but a common philosophy and religion. In 1202, the Muslim Ghurids advanced into the Gangetic Valley. Muhammad's empire, under his careful supervision, was governed by a network of Turkish warriors, known as the Mamluks, who began their careers as slaves, nephews, cousins, and kinsmen. In 1206, Muhammad of Ghor suppressed a rebellion in Punjab and was returning to Lahore. He set up camp on the banks of the Indus River for the night. While sleeping, an assassin emerged from the darkness, stabbed him to death, and vanished. This assassination was attributed to the Hashashins, a sect of Shiite Muslims. Muhammad's death marked the end of his empire. Within a few months, the vast country was divided among his successors. The business of governance and continuity differed in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China. In China, the greatest struggle was between the virtues and vices of the king. The threat to the throne initially arose from its own nature. Xia kings ascended to power based on their virtues and wisdom. When the succession of the throne was based on bloodline, the sons gradually became lazy, laziness led to corruption, corruption led to disintegration, and disintegration resulted in the downfall of the dynasty. A new and intelligent individual would seize the throne, a new dynasty would rise, but the cycle would repeat itself. Virtuous individuals couldn't remain committed to fundamental principles for long. Good intentions turned into mistrust, piety into empty beliefs, refinement into pride, and futile displays. Sima Qian said, "The way is a cycle, where it ends, it begins again." The Xia dynasty struggled with itself, and when it fell into the hands of its own people. The cycle had begun again. Around 1200 BC, Wu Ting from the Shang dynasty had grown up among the people, and when he became the ruler, he remained silent for 3 years. Even afterwards, he had a tendency towards silence, but when he spoke, his words were filled with harmonious wisdom. He governed the regions of Yin admirably and calmly. However, Shu, who took over the Shang dynasty, misused his intelligence and eloquence. He looked down on everyone, loved wine, was lustful towards women, and indulged in pleasure-seeking. He raised taxes to fill pleasure gardens with game animals. He had a pool built and filled it with wine, hanging meat around it like a forest. He encouraged naked men and women to chase each other around the pool. These bizarre antics led to severe cruelty. Nobles suspected of disloyalty were subjected to cruel torture. He flayed the skin of one of his workers and sliced and dried the other in strips. Eventually, the external enemy joined forces with his own people, and Shu died in his burning palace. According to the Chinese, it was Shu's lawlessness that led to his death. According to Chinese historians, decay always originates from within. The old order had perished in the flames, and a new order had emerged. During the Trojan War, as depicted in Homer's epic poem, the Iliad, an epidemic breaks out in the Mycenaean camp on the shores of the Aegean Sea. Bubonic plague spreads to all the coastal regions of the Aegean by ships. Plague, drought, and war, these are enough to disrupt the balance of the civilizations existing in rocky, arid lands. Those who can flee to distant places. The Mycenaeans, the Cretans, and the inhabitants of other Aegean islands search for new lands in small groups in distant lands. They become mercenaries, serving others. By the mid-11th century BCE, the rulers of the south were no longer the Mycenaeans but the Dorians. The Dorians, who had no kings and had no knowledge of foreign trade, turned to farming, survived, and felt no need to write. Their invasions plunged the peninsula into a period we call the Dark Ages. We do not know what happened exactly because there are no written records. During this period, the Babylonians and the Assyrians were not exempt from the famines, droughts, and epidemics that ravaged the world. The desperate and hungry people spread to the surrounding mountains. Like the Dorians, the Aramaeans did not know how to write. Mesopotamia also entered a dark age. In the first year of the Peloponnesian War, around 430 BCE, Athens was struck by an epidemic. Thucydides, who was present in the city at the time, describes those days as follows: suddenly, they would feel a strong heat in their heads, their throats and tongues would become inflamed, and a dry cough would ensue. In many cases, death would come from internal bleeding on the 7th or 8th day. The disease would descend from the abdomen to the private parts, settling in the toes. Those who survived the illness would lose certain body parts, and some even lost their sight. The piled-up corpses were being burned throughout the day. No one paid attention to religious rituals, and theft was rampant in empty houses. The distance between the sacred and the profane had diminished due to the survival instinct. The most terrible aspect of the disease was the despair it instilled. When someone fell ill, they would lose their resistance as they sank into hopelessness, making them an easier victim for the illness. The Slavs, Huns, Turks and Mongols were skilled warriors and seemed to live on horseback. When a Khan formed a circle of trust with his most loyal men, it was called the First Circle. They despised settled societies. While the Huns wreaked havoc across Europe, they became enemies of the settled peoples and often killed them. They were conquerors but did not know how to govern the territories they occupied. This was also the reason behind the massacres committed by the Mongols in Anatolia and other regions. On the other hand, they did not know how to wage war in cities or how to capture them. They only learned this through the military school established by Genghis Khan. They also failed against the Chinese because, apart from not liking water, they did not know how to overcome water barriers. The Chinese were able to survive only when they had a large river behind them. Whenever the Turks encountered the sea, they turned their backs. They avoided developing strategies involving the seas and oceans. However, to rule the world, they needed to conquer the seas. Genghis Khan had determined the duties and ranks of his personal guards. This now constituted a force of 10,000, which would serve as the heart of the empire. Wherever he went, a mobile administrative center would move with him, forming a state on horseback. When Genghis Khan annihilated the Merkit tribe of 10,000 people, he celebrated his victory with the following words: "We tore their lungs apart, emptied their beds, and wiped out their kin, their remaining women. Of course, we took as captives. Thus, we annihilated the Merkit people." It took the Mongols 4 years to reach Jin's capital, Songdo. These years were filled with raids, retreats, reorganizations, insufficient provisions, and costly wars. They had always lived on the move and never experienced peace. Every experience gained from a battle was incorporated into the plan for the next one. The dam they built on the Yellow River branch resulted in flooding their own camps instead of the enemy's. By 1124, Genghis Khan had learned how to besiege a walled city, withstand an assault by heavily armed infantry, and repel a fortified force. They had no experience in achieving victory against a settled population. Therefore, they completely destroyed the inhabitants of the cities they conquered. Regarding the fate of the city of Songdo, the Tabaqat-i Nizari of those days writes: "Years later, when Bahadin, the leader of an envoy sent by Harizm Sultan Muhammad, approached the city, he saw a white hill and inquired about it. He learned that it was made up of the bones of the slaughtered inhabitants of the city. In another place, along a long road, the earth had turned grey from the oil of human bodies. Between 1215 and 1229, the Mongols set their sights on the west of the Amu Darya. The Jin capital, Songdo, and the northern part of the empire had fallen into the hands of the Mongols. At the same time, they were advancing towards the west, towards the Amu Darya. Genghis Khan had learned that there were many paths to establishing an empire, including diplomacy. On the other side of the Amu Darya, there was the Khwarezm Kingdom, a Turkish state that had separated from Khorasan after the downfall of the Great Seljuks half a century earlier. It was led by Shah Ala-ad-Din Muhammad ibn Tekish. While Genghis Khan was at war in northern China, Shah Ala-ad-Din was advancing towards Baghdad, hoping to seize the caliphate. When he heard about the Mongol advance, he turned back and encountered 3 Mongol envoys. The secretary of the Shah conveyed that Genghis' message was as follows: "I, Genghis, consider it my duty to establish friendly relations with you. It would be beneficial for both of us." However, Shah Ala-ad-Din, hardened by 20 years of war, perceived only a threat and bribed one of the envoys to offer espionage services. He had the second envoy killed. Genghis Khan's anger brought disaster and a decrease in population to the world. Bloodshed reigned from all sides. When the city of Merv fell in 1221, 700,000 people were massacred, leaving only 80 artisans alive. Anyone in the city had their heads severed. Pyramids were made from the heads of men, women, and children separately. Even the city's cats and dogs were killed. In 1258, 100,000 people were killed in Baghdad, and everything representing civilization was destroyed. The Ottoman Kaiser, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, had said, "Either I conquer Constantinople, or this city will conquer me, dead or alive. My only desire is this city, even if it is empty." On May 28th, the bombardment suddenly ceased, and every man, cannon, horse, and archer under Mehmed's command converged upon the city walls. According to Christian sources, there were so many corpses in the Sea of Marmara that they floated like melons in the canals of Venice. The day after the conquest, Mehmed arrested and executed his vizier Halil Pasha. He was now powerful and had no need for the old man. For Christians, the chain in the east had been broken. It marked the beginning of many things. Fleeing scholars from the city sparked a wave of Greek thought in European courts, sowing the seeds of new nations and wars. Ottoman sources that describe the siege in detail portray not only the victory but also severed limbs and heads, fire and ruins, dust, death, and devastation, stating, "A calamity, as commanded by the Almighty Allah, rained directly upon the infidels." After reigning for 37 years, Byzantine King Manuel passed away in 1180. His young wife Marie had given him an heir, Alexios II. At just 11 years old, Alexios became the ruler with Marie acting as regent. However, within a year, Marie fell out of favor for granting excessive privileges to Italian merchants, and Manuel's nephew Alexios was appointed as his chief advisor. Alexios was a weak and indulgent individual, who spent most of his days in bed, keeping the curtains closed to avoid sunlight, and indulging in decayed fantasies. Manuel's cousin Andronikos Komnenos, who had been exiled due to causing unrest on the throne, returned upon hearing the dissatisfaction of the people. His return sparked a revolt, leading to the lynching of Pisans, Genoese, and remaining Venetians in the city. The remaining Italians were gathered and sold as slaves to the Turks. As Andronikos assumed the throne, Marie was drowned, and Alexios was blinded. A chronicler described the situation as follows: "He loaded the vineyards of Bursa not with grapes but with the bodies of those he hanged, not allowing anyone to take them down, desiring to see them dry and swing in the sun." Andronikos continued his reign of murder, causing immense discontent among the people within 2 years. In 1185, he sent someone to kill Isaac Angelos, a distant relative, without any justification. Isaac, a moderate man, resisted the executioner and killed him, becoming a hero in the eyes of the people. Filled with uncontrollable rage, the people captured and lynched Andronikos. His body hung for days before being thrown into a cesspool. Shortly after AD 1140, Italian scholar Gerardo of Cremona traveled to the Iberian Peninsula. He hoped to find a copy of the Greek astronomy book known as Almagest. The southern part of the peninsula had been under Arab rule for centuries, and Muslim rulers had brought thousands of classical texts with them. These texts had been translated into Arabic, but the versions in Western languages had long been lost. The Library of Toledo, which had been captured by one of the Christian kingdoms, housed many of these precious books. The Christian zealots had gradually destroyed these books, which had experienced a golden age between the 8th and 11th centuries, through the efforts of Islamic scholars who translated them into Arabic. Gerardo found more than he had hoped for, not only astronomy texts but also classical and Arabic texts on dialectics, geometry, philosophy, and medicine. The unknown works of Euclid, Galen, Ptolemy, and Aristotle were there. Determined, Gerardo set out to learn Arabic and dedicated his life to translating these books. The Renaissance had begun. The Renaissance represented a revival of interest in Greek and Roman knowledge, a rediscovery of the classical knowledge that had been abandoned and forgotten. Many scholars, most of them Italians, sought to reconnect with Greek and Roman thinkers through Arab libraries. In the late 11th century, heresy of Cathars flourished in the south of France, more powerful and radical than before. The Cathars, in their pursuit of purity, sought to minimize interaction with the material world. They observed fasting, abstained from sexual relations, and endured suffering through prayer and meditation marathons. It was a suitable time for Pope Innocent III to revive the Crusade fervor. With the Crusade already declared, the list of heretics expanded. Not only Cathars but also Orthodox Raymond, who refused to obey orders, and non-Christian Slavic tribes in northern Germany were targeted. Among the Crusaders gathered in Lyon was Simon de Montfort, the Earl of Leicester, who had found a new cause. The Albigensian Crusade lasted for 20 years. In besieged cities, people were burned alive. When asked how the heretics could be distinguished, the Grand Inquisitor said, "Kill them all, God will recognize his own." In 1318, King Philip V of France failed to fulfill his promise and was unable to embark on the crusade for the fifth consecutive year. The problem was both logistical and related to the troubled state of the country. His coronation coincided with a severe famine and a cold year. Storms and heavy rains, followed by dry spells and sudden unbearable cold, persisted. The people were starving. Aggressive shepherds ravaged the countryside. Suddenly, an unorganized group emerged, consisting of common people. They were joined by bandits and outlaws. Pillaging primarily targeted priests and monasteries. The next target was the Jews. Relations with England were also strained. The internal situation in England was dire after the famine. Farmers and villagers blamed greedy merchants and corrupt judges for their problems, while merchants and judges blamed the English barons, and the barons held the king responsible. Meanwhile, King Edward II, who had been in power for 15 years, was cowardly and unlucky. Collaborating with his wife, the Earl of Flanders with the help of the barons, suddenly invaded England in 1325. In 1326, King Edward's lover, Hugh Despenser, was quartered and his genitalia mutilated. King Edward himself was killed by having a hot iron rod inserted into his anus. The beginning of the struggle between the church hierarchy and Aristotelian logic is the 11th century. The foundations of the Renaissance were laid in the 12th century when the Crusades came to an end. By the year 1340, the Renaissance had progressed to such an extent that it had become visible. The Renaissance, which grew as a conflict between sacred texts and science, creation and evolution, is still ongoing today. 5 centuries ago, Europe introduced 4 new catalysts to reorganize human life. Liberating freedom and beauty from the darkness of religion. Establishing contact with every corner of the world through new discoveries and technologies. Placing greater importance on human beings and their needs. Embracing a new understanding of how religion should be perceived. While the possibility of a new Renaissance may seem far-fetched today, we are in a period where humanity is rapidly moving towards awakening and renewal, leading to a social explosion. This should also be considered in conjunction with the need to address humanity's problems within a universal framework. Nations and their peoples should be liberated from their internal isolation. What we call history is actually a bloody past. Wars, violence, torture, massacres, tyranny, and disasters. World history is nothing but a dance of death. In 541, the bubonic plague outbreak that began in the Nile Delta in Egypt spread to Anatolia and Europe through grain ships in the eastern Mediterranean. It repeatedly ravaged people for 2 centuries until its final outbreak in southern Italy in 767. It was a sudden death. A wound, resembling a snake bite, would appear in the groin or armpit, leaving the person weak, and they would die on the 2nd or 3rd day. People fled to mountains and other places, leaving the city's marketplaces and streets devoid of grass and bushes. Famine was another calamity. It occurred on average once every 4 years in the 9th century. It decreased to once every 10 years in the 10th century but rose again in the 11th century. In the 700s and 1005s, famine struck Ireland, and people resorted to cannibalism, consuming each other. Those who had no flour collected and ate various herbs but swelled up and died. The poor were willing to become slaves for a morsel of food. Famine and disaster hit a different place every year. However, no cycle of misery plagued an entire continent. The terrifying outbreak of the Black Death in the 14th century has been interpreted by many as a punishment for the collective sins of humanity. The plague outbreak, which can be considered as the end of the world, occurred between 1338 and 1353. The outbreak started just west of China. Tugun Temur, a descendant of Kublai Khan, was on the Yuan dynasty throne in China. On one of the tombstones south of Lake Usuk in 1338 to 1339, it is written, "This is the grave of Kutluk. He died with his wife in the epidemic." The plague reached Constantinople, Europe, and Egypt through the Indian trade routes and Mongol invasions from the north. The plague was an invasion of darkness, the work of the devil. Chroniclers recount how the Mongols catapulted the corpses of soldiers who died in the epidemic to the other side of city walls. The plague ravaged Asia, India, Syria, and Europe alike. In Constantinople, the plague, which had previously killed 1 million people in the 6th century, now claimed half the population. In just 1 month, 56,000 people died in Marseille. Almost half of England was also affected. Petrarch wrote, "The life we lead is asleep, no matter what we do, we are dreaming. Only death awakens us from sleep. I wish to have awakened before this." In 1397, Emir Hussein in Bel was practically under the rule of the Chagatai Khanate, which was a part of the Mongol Empire. However, Emir Hussein's star was shining brightly. He distributed most of his spoils to his soldiers, providing them with clothing, weapons, belts, and offering them wine from the hands of the most beautiful women in the world. Timur, who was displeased with this situation, set a trap for him in the capital city of Bel on April 10th. When Isfahan fell, he ordered the killing of 70,000 people. Timur demanded unconditional surrender from anyone he perceived as a rival or enemy. After capturing a city, there was a specific number of people that each Mongol warrior had to kill, and they would collect the ears of those killed as proof of compliance. Timur was not a philosopher, he only knew one ethic: victory. In the north, Tokhtamysk unleashed his full savagery on the Russian princes. He looted their treasures, destroyed their homes, and massacred women and children. When Timur reached his borders, Tokhtamysk had already crushed and subjugated the Russians. However, Tokhtamysk refused to submit to Timur's authority. According to Russian chroniclers, Timur was much more merciless, ruthless, and terrifying as a torturer. The Russian princes joined Tokhtamysk and suffered another defeat in 1395. Tokhtamysk escaped and spent the rest of his life in hiding. Timur's new target was the Delhi Sultanate. Towers were built from the heads of Hindus, and in a single day, the heads of 10,000 people were severed. Women and children were enslaved, and grain storehouses were set on fire. Next in line was the Ottoman Empire under Bayezid I the Thunderbolt, who was considered as military genius by Europe. But first, Timur set fire to Baghdad and then turned his attention north to the Ottoman front. After defeating the Ottoman army on July 28, 1402, he sent the following message to the Byzantine emperor: "Hold the strait tightly with galleys so that the Ottoman soldiers cannot escape." Then, the kingdom of Georgia was devastated. All of Europe held its breath in fear after defeats of Ottomans and Georgians, waiting for Timur. However, he turned towards the east and returned to the Yuan territories in China that he had not conquered. On February 18, 1405, after 3 days of a lavish feast where he had consumed too much, he fell into a coma and died. He did not establish any infrastructure or administrative network in the places he conquered. As a result, instability quickly ensued in the occupied territories. The Roman ruler Caligula had learned a great deal about debauchery, sex parties, and torture from his predecessor, his uncle Tiberius. He became obsessed with public shows where gladiators fought. After cutting out the tongues of prisoners, so they couldn't scream, they were thrown to wild animals as feed. When animal feed became expensive, prisoners were used to feed the wild beasts instead. The emperor's mental health deteriorated even further. He branded his accompanying nobles with hot irons and sent them to work in the mines. Some were kept in cages, forced to crawl on all fours like animals and torn apart. Families were forced to witness the executions of their own children. Caligula, who had completely alienated the ruling class, was assassinated by being stabbed during a banquet in 41 AD. In 1749, Crown Prince Sado ascended to the throne of the Korean kingdom. In 1757, he beheaded a eunuch and threw his head into the midst of the palace crowd. He developed a phobia of clothing. Every morning, 20 to 30 outfits were prepared for him. He would burn a few of them as offerings to spirits, and if he didn't like the presentation of the clothes, he would injure or kill the servant responsible. During his travels, he demanded that the roads be completely cleared, and if he saw someone on the road, he would strip off his own clothes and set them on fire. In 1762, after brutally beating his second wife, he began disguising himself and wandering in rural areas, hosting wild parties with travelers. He would kill fortune tellers whose predictions he didn't like. He would spend hours lying in a tomb-sized room built beneath his residence. Eventually, the real king realized that the royal family was in danger and ordered the death of his son in 1762. Belgium's King Leopold II, known as one of the most ruthless rulers of the 19th century, established a brutal regime in Central Africa. The region was rich in valuable ivory, minerals, and rubber. Leopold's army treated the local population like slaves, enforcing strict control over the region and using whips made of hippopotamus skin in the shape of rubber cords. Women were held hostage in villages, while men were forced to collect rubber. Each village head had to gather 4 to 5 kilograms of rubber every 2 weeks per male member. Those who resisted were mercilessly killed. Leopold amassed enormous wealth at the cost of half of the Congo's population. Every bullet fired had to have a valid reason. The hand of each person shot was cut off, smoked, and sent to Leopold's agents as proof. Throughout history, many sadistic women have emerged, and one of them was Doña Catalina, who lived in the north of Santiago, Chile, during the 17th century when it was part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire. She was known as La Quintrala due to her red hair. Born in 1604, she had poisoned her father with a toxic chicken to inherit his estate prematurely. She ruled over her tenants, servants, and slaves with extreme cruelty. Chains, handcuffs, mouth gags, and whips made of untreated leather were used to discipline those she deemed guilty. She burned some alive and occasionally threw them into cold water. She even stabbed a prestigious man with whom she had a romantic relationship, but blamed her crime on an executed servant. In 1655, she stood trial in Santiago, accused of the deaths of at least 40 servants. However, due to illness, she escaped the death penalty and was sentenced to house arrest, where she died the same year. Throughout history, human life has been relatively short. In feudal societies, people would engage in farming during times of peace to pay their taxes, and in times of war, they would die for their king or emperor. However, the most feared punishment was the death penalty. Under the laws of Babylonian King Hammurabi, 25 different crimes could warrant a death sentence. The Mosaic Law allowed for stoning, beheading, hanging, and crucifixion, with the latter being abolished in the 4th century by Roman Emperor Constantine. In medieval Europe, torture was often employed before execution. The average lifespan for men during the Middle Ages did not exceed 35. During the reign of King Henry VIII, 72,000 people were executed by the state. Danish King James IV caused the execution of 40,000 elderly women in 1590, accusing them of causing storms and sinking his ships under the charge of witchcraft. The root cause of all problems in the world, ranging from widespread poverty to committing various crimes and engaging in wars, lies in the negativity present in the emotions and thoughts of humanity. It is the combative mindset of human beings that poses a threat to the destruction of our planet. To enable people to live in peace, understanding, and harmony, all we need to do is erase our preconceptions and listen to the voice of reason. The path of accepting one's own fate and embracing all the pain it entails provides an opportunity to imbue life with deeper meaning, even in the face of the harshest conditions. Your life can be courageous, honorable, and unique. However, only a few individuals possess the ability to reach such high moral standards. It is a state where a person's inner strength transcends their external destiny. It is the relationship between great destinies and great individuals. The threshold at which humanity stands in history is the decision of what the next step should be. The world belongs to those who know where they are going. People have yet to learn to see the world as a place of infinite possibilities. We think we know people, but in reality, we see in them what we are searching for. Even if two individuals manage to truly know each other, there remains a distance between them. They can't fully open up to one another. We always encounter ourselves in others, and escaping loneliness is impossible because the ongoing cause of the problems in our lives is still the retirement phase of conversation. The main obstacle before conversation is our inability to place words into an unfamiliar heart. The challenge is to grasp the delicacy required to converse with women, which makes the problem even more chronic. What inspires conversation is the differences between us. People can only begin to be equal when they start learning how to converse. Love is the most powerful enchantment for the majority of people today. It is what makes two strangers believe they cannot live without each other, and it also evokes fear, the fear of losing. The ultimate and highest goal that a person can yearn for is love. The mystery behind human existence is the salvation through love and being saved within love. Love is as powerful as death. The world is a theater where ghosts roam, and it is filled with memories. Gods have passed through here. There may have been one or perhaps a few defining moments in your life, but generally, those are rare. The rest is the mundane slices of your life. Never look back anymore. Embrace loss as part of progress and take action. It is when you face challenges that you truly find yourself. Harness the demon within you. There should be something inside you that angers and excites you, like an injured animal. Deceive yourself a little into the deceitful affairs of the world. Avoid becoming predictable. Be courageous, do not fear. The greatest cause of hopeless loves is the expectation of hearing the words "I love you" at least once. Perhaps this was the pivotal moment in your life. Memories should be lived and never forgotten. Gravestones were a Roman tradition, but very few people's ages were accurately known. Furthermore, nobody was interested in counting people, and even if asked, a precise answer could not be given. The closest thing to a population census were labor declarations and a handful of property declarations that began in the 9th century. Research conducted in ancient cemeteries provides us with significant clues about human life in history. From the graves of people who lived in the south of England between the 5th and 8th centuries, we understand that at least 20% of the entire community died before reaching the age of 18. Only about 6% lived to the age of 60 and above. The ratio of adult women to men was 2 to 3. The average age of death for women was 31, while for men, it was 38. Women were more likely to die during childbirth, while men often lost their lives in war or hunting, far away from their homes. Other indications revealed by skeletal remains in European cemeteries included dental problems such as severe wear and abscesses, arm and leg fractures, joint infections, osteoarthritis, wooden legs, and decapitated individuals. Before the Industrial Revolution, death was associated not with the elderly, as it is today, but rather with the young. Infant and child mortality rates were particularly high in societies engaged in agriculture. In fact, it is estimated that in pre-modern times, 1/3 to half of all children died before reaching the age of 2. Inadequate nutrition, severe diarrhea, and various infections, followed by mysterious diseases such as measles or smallpox, would mercilessly cause significant losses every year. Infant deaths were so common that it became a prevalent resignation, ingrained in adult culture. In some societies, parents would refrain from naming their babies until there was a glimmer of hope for their survival. The natural causes that posed a threat to human life began to significantly decline in the 18th century with advancements in scientific agriculture, followed by new approaches to public health in the 19th century, and the therapeutic and healing effects of medical practices in the 20th century. While still predominantly limited to the developed Western populations, through the shaping of nature and evidence-based approaches to diseases, the majority of natural hazards have been reduced to a single demographic, the elderly. On the other hand, deaths caused by other humans, natural disasters, and pandemics continue to persist. However, the targets have shifted slightly. For nearly the past 2,000 years, the overwhelming majority of victims consisted of newborns, the innocent, the impoverished, and those without notable education or access to political power. For a significant portion of human history, death's common causes were often infectious diseases, various acts of violence, or complications during childbirth. Life was short, and death was sudden. Doctors, lacking knowledge about the causes of diseases, would helplessly wait on the sidelines. Even in industrializing England, the average life expectancy was between 30 and 40 years before the 1870s. Only about 5% of women and men would reach the age of 70. The global average life expectancy increased by 6 years, from 2000 to 2019, rising from 66.8 years to 73.4 years. However, there is a significant difference between living long and living healthy. In 2000, healthy life expectancy was 58.3 years, while in 2019, it was determined to be 63.7 years. In summary, according to a report by the World Health Organization, the gap between age of death and healthy life expectancy has widened in the past decade in a negative direction. Similar to the previous millennia, in the 1900s, most people were dying from infectious diseases. Throughout the 20th century, there was hope that this emerging enemy in developed countries would eventually cease to be a public health threat. Despite significant progress in diagnosis, treatment, and preventive measures, optimism has faded. In the 1960s, new types of influenza started to emerge worldwide. They were followed by sexually transmitted diseases in the 1970s. During the 1970s and 1980s, 30 new types of infectious diseases were identified, and familiar diseases such as malaria and rabies, which developed resistance to vaccines and treatments, regained their strength. Similar to the impact of the 1918 to 1919 flu, epidemic diseases caused by a Hong Kong origin influenza strain transmitted from birds raised alarm in the 1990s. A study conducted in the early 20th century determined that among young individuals aged 15 to 24, traffic accidents were the leading cause of death, followed by homicides. Modern society is dependent on electricity, communication, and the flow of information. If you remove these for a certain period, hospitals, airlines, and banks won't function, and food cannot be stored. As a result, modernity is an unfinished project. What remains is a wasteful society from the project of modernity. However, one of humanity's greatest abilities is the power to initiate unstoppable things. These can be new and significant beginnings caused by major destructions such as wars, revolutions, or great disasters. Through utopia, humanity has tried to maintain its hope and optimism. However, wars, economic crises, environmental factors, technological advancements, and inhumane events over the past 150 years have shaken the concept of utopia. Society, unable to hold its own destiny, is restless and indifferent. It depicts a society that has either accepted living in fear or has been forced to accept it, where mechanisms that depend on these fears hold sway. This is a civilization of forgetting in multiple uncertainties. In history, Few individuals have been able to justify the hopes attached to them in childhood or utilize more than a small fraction of their talents. Life is becoming increasingly complex and filled with dilemmas, but as this chaos grows, the cracks in which you can navigate and find overlooked clues also multiply. Do you think life is just about satisfying your hunger and taking care of your family? People who perceive life as meaningless may prefer to close their eyes and live in the past. Unless a person derives greater meaning from the seemingly meaningless and painful circumstances, they cannot redirect their life towards a new direction. No one can tell another person what the purpose of their life is. Everyone must find it for themselves and take on the responsibility prescribed by that answer. It is your task to decide whether the mission of life is towards society or towards oneself. The more a person dedicates themselves to a cause they will serve or a person they will love, the more they become human and fulfill themselves. At birth, you were encoded with negative traits such as greed, hatred, and ignorance, turning you into a skilled liar and opportunist like a cunning shark. In the general course of the world, the thinking individual was often in an unhappy environment, facing hardships like hunger, poverty, and enslavement. What matters is understanding, and what people often refer to as fate is usually their own foolish choices. The three indicators of foolishness are ambition, arrogance, and pride. Everyone lives within their own consciousness, and within everyone lies the same pitiful and naive individual. When one moves away from one source of suffering, they move closer to another. A person with a rich inner world will strive to avoid suffering, not neglect themselves, and seek solitude. They will seek a calm, humble, and unhindered life. An extraordinary mind leads to distancing oneself from society. We exist for a purpose. The reason for our arrival in this world is to purify our souls and reach higher realms. Each person on earth has a spiritual task to fulfill. We can say that a civilization decaying from within has been struck by a natural disaster. Most of the skeletons show signs of a natural disease, with the most common being anemia due to food shortages. As cities grow, more trees are cut down, and the disappearance of forests brings about floods. Some large settlements can barely be described as civilizations. Those without civilization are nomadic groups under the command of their leaders. They don't build buildings, have no script, and lack agricultural words like plow or harvesting ground in their languages. Their only known expertise is in warfare, and they stand out with their weapons and horses. Like all kings, they seek an enemy, an easy target. Peace is based on fear. Throughout history, the history of peoples has been oppressed under the rule of despots, and the issue today is to free themselves from despots and corrupt state systems devoid of true justice. Because they are death machines. Pandora's box, the source of all evil, perversions and sins, the contradiction of love and hate, lies within your subconscious. There is no concept of time in the subconscious. The subconscious is pitch dark. There are many illusions and stories mixed with truths, but you must recognize the true dragon, the devil. For that, discover the limits of your essence and the universal laws of nature. Live as a human, driven by the desire to find meaning in your life. Mortal humans can rise to immortality through superior knowledge. Death is actually a new beginning where all negativities are reset. Death is a compulsory passage gate in the vast pool of universal life. In short, there is no such thing as death. It is only a door opening to a new life. When dying, we must close our eyes with excitement, thinking, I will soon learn the great secret. Welcome, death. Death is also related to life because all moments that make up life are dying. A lived moment will never return. Every moment of life should be evaluated in the best possible way and lived as if experiencing it for the second time. Nothing in the past is lost irretrievably, on the contrary, everything is preserved in an irreversibly hidden form. The currency of evolution is neither wars nor hunger and suffering, it is simply the copying of DNA spirals. The tragic trio of life is pain, guilt, and death. If a person cannot change the situation causing the pain, they can determine their attitude towards it. For example, if you become blind, you either try to live with it or try to prevent it from destroying you. Life should not be mythologized. The atmosphere of death suddenly exposes all your masks, makes you realize that you are alone, and all your relationships are just illusions created to forget this fact and to create a family so that you don't feel alone. Nothing is lost forever. There is a painful progression in this world, and we live and leave this world longing for what is left behind and wanting to find the past in eternity. The only thing that binds us to the past, longings, the future, and infinity is love. Let's live to find souls that will hold our hands forever with more love and affection. The only thing you need to tell your loved ones when dying is, "Don't forget me. I'll be waiting above." A person dies when they are forgotten.